Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly O'Horo, and this is Adaptable, Behavior Explained. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today to Adaptable. I'm excited to share with you a conversation that is really near and dear to my heart and to many viewers as well. And I'm really excited to have our guest with us today to talk about this topic. We're going to talk about the intersection of religion and faith with therapy. And with me, I have my friend and colleague, Brianna Itter. And I'm so happy to have her because we have really rich, beautiful conversations about this topic all the time. And so I couldn't think of a better guest to have on the show today with you to share more about this topic. So Brianna, welcome and thank you so much for being with us. Please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. So I am a licensed associate counselor. I work at Infinite Healing and Wellness with Kelly and many other wonderful therapists. I recently moved up to Northern Arizona with my family. So I've moved completely online with my clients, which has been quite the transition. It reminds me a bit of COVID, and we are rolling with it. It's going
being
well.
Adaptable and flexible.
Yes. That's one reason why I think we're meeting virtually today, which I love.
Right. And that said, the reason we wanted to talk about this topic is because religion is such an important concept, and faith even more so for so much of the population, and spirituality and how people think about something greater than ourselves is so varied. But for most of us, it plays a role, or it plays a part in how we see ourselves, how we view ourselves in the world. It helps us to determine values, our morals, and how we socially get along. And a lot of times this is an important concept to discuss when it comes to the concept of therapy and getting therapy as well, because this can be a little bit of a conflict internally and externally for people when it comes to this topic. So let's talk a little bit more about why this is important. Can you share with us why for you this is a really important conversation to be having with our listeners today?
Absolutely. So I am a person of faith. I grew up Christian in a Christian household. Faith has been a part of my story for a very long time, as well as how I've shifted throughout the years in how I just understand my faith, how I interact with it, my relationship with it. Even in recent years, being a therapist has definitely been a big shift in and of itself. So there's been a lot of thought, a lot of struggle, a lot of meaning in this for me. And it's been such a journey, and I wouldn't have it any other way. And it's just a big part of my life.
Well, and I would say that the whole idea of evolution, of growth, I would hope is something that does change. It's not linear. And so as we learn ourselves, as we understand ourselves better in relationship with our faith, whatever that faith may be, I think that the more we learn in those relationships, the more we start to look at and analyze the way faith interacts in our life as well. And, I want to really start out with something to say. We want to disclose and be honoring that we're just humans. We're both licensed therapists, but we're not theologians. We do not have masters in religion. We do not have additional advanced education. We are just humans who see clients, and religion plays a big role. And so if we misspeak or if we get something wrong, we're speaking anecdotally. We do have some research to support some things we're going to talk about, but mostly we're going to talk about experiences and how people can figure out how to make some decisions for themselves related to faith, and really hope to broaden perspective a little bit about the way religion can really play a prominent and helpful role for people. And also, it doesn't have to have anything to do with the therapeutic process and experience if that's not for someone, and that it's very personalized. So I just want to disclose that. We're going to do our best to be honoring, but please recognize we know the imperfection that is likely to be part of this show, and we're going to do our best to be honoring. One thing that I think is a really important and notable concept is there has been globally an increase in spirituality, but specifically in the US, 41% of people say they've grown more spiritual over their lifetime. And the percentage of Americans who consider themselves spiritual but not religious has actually increased from 6% in 2009 to nearly 25% in recent years. So people tend to be trending towards less religiosity and more spirituality, which I think is an interesting thing in and of itself when it comes to the concept of religion. And there has been a bit of a decrease in religiosity. And like 33% of people report becoming less religious over time. And I think that that's something to note because there's also people that identify as both religious and spiritual. And there's a whole broad variation of how people identify. And then even within specific religions, we were talking earlier while we were preparing for the show a little bit. And I said, we could be sitting in the same church, identify in the same faith, and someone right next to us might be interpreting whatever is being said by the pastor or the priest or, the rabbi, a very different experience or interpretation of what was being said. And so I think there's a lot of flexibility when it comes to perspective. And so anyway, I think that this topic is important to discuss for those reasons, as well as I know that it can often be considered a potential barrier in going to therapy. So all that to say, please share with us and our listeners why for you personally, this is such an important topic and why you have so much passion related to this conversation today.
I think a big part of my own journey, not only as a human, but as a therapist, has been to grow and to expand and understand more myself and others. And a big part of that has been navigating these gray areas of life. And I had to figure out how that fit into my faith. It's how does that coincide, and how can I operate as a therapist and still be a Christian while not putting any of my faith or any of my personal bias on others. So as I've worked out that conflict and that struggle within myself, a beautiful balance has emerged. And I have many conversations with therapists as well as just in my personal life about how we can incorporate faith in everyday activities. And it really doesn't have to be black or white or scary or too much for anybody where we just have to go, I can't do that. It's something that we can all navigate if we have the right tools.
Right. And it makes me think about the fact that we're humans first when we enter the therapeutic office. And although we have extensive training and ethics training and guidance on how we are to really leave our own personal values and beliefs at the door and meet our clients where they are, and what matters to them is really the only interest we should have is what do you need? What's working for you? What's not? What do you find helpful? And truthfully, what are resources that you find in your life that help to make you feel more resilient? And I think that for us as therapists, it can be tricky at times to respectfully integrate a client's faith into their therapeutic practice and their experience without imposing our own beliefs, because we do bring implicit bias to every situation, whether we want to or not. And we also have our own personal experiences that help, to guide our thought processes and everything else. So how do we approach this as therapists? What are some things we can share with our listeners that we approach this in order to be respectful while integrating someone's faith and leaving our own personal beliefs at the door?
Yes, great question. A great first place to start for any therapist is coming in with non-judgment. We come in, we look at this person in front of us, and we recognize they're a whole human being apart from us. They have this huge wealth of knowledge of their own life and their own beliefs, and it's getting curious. It's going, how do they live out their faith? What is faith to them? What's that relationship they have with their faith And just what does that look like for them? Everybody's very different. And so if we go in with curious eyes, it can help a lot with understanding your client, where they're coming from, and even help with any personal biases you may have as well. So often I go into sessions and I have to remind myself, oh, even though maybe I have very similar life background to this person, I don't know what they're going through. They do. They need to tell me. And that's the same for any topic. Religion, spirituality, faith is just one of those subtopics that we go into.
And understanding how someone's faith or spiritual practices or religious culture has influenced them, both for the positive and for the negative. Because let's be honest, with all religion, there's an interpretation that involves man. And depending on where messages came from, they can look very different. This priest or this bishop might say one thing, whereas the next one in the same faith and the same religion might say something very different. And so those messages can sometimes be quite confusing. And so I think it's really important for us as the listener to just open with curiosity, like you said, and say, what's important to you about your religious background, the way that you were raised, what you're currently still practicing, and what things are useful and helpful to you. And then, is it okay? Can I have an invitation to utilize those resources if it feels appropriate while we're working together? Because I want to make sure that people have at their disposal whatever resources are going to help them heal more expeditiously. But I think that's something that comes up oftentimes that people have to also consider is when faith or religious practices have been, where behaviors have been under the guise of religion or faith, when in fact it's man, and probably maybe not necessarily of the faith, but it's part of a cultural upbringing where sometimes shame and things like that have been part of the picture of the person's life. And then for us to work to tease out those things and help someone find clarity from, this is part of faith, this is part of how you were raised. That sounds more like a family belief or more like a cultural situation or a cultural consideration, and maybe not necessarily religion in general. So it really is a teasing out process, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. And we're spiritual beings. It's part of us. It's a very common phrase that most of us have heard: mind, body, spirit. We're not just one or the other. And it doesn't always just, okay, we can just separate one little part of our lives and not have to look at the rest. They all influence the other. And this is no different. And it's just being really mindful and considerate of what the other person's going through, and honestly working through your own internal conflicts that might get in the way of you just holding space for somebody and helping them reach their goals, which is our role as a therapist. We're not here to change somebody, fix somebody. I'm your guide. I'm your helper. I'm partnering with you in this journey. You've shared with me these goals that you have, and I'm going to help you through that. I'm going to help you try to get to that point B for starting here, right? It's this give and take.
Right. One of our awarenesses as therapists is to recognize countertransference, and where sometimes our own stuff comes up when people are sharing with us. Do you have any examples? I know that I've got a couple examples where I know that I was personally triggered and having some major countertransference when people were talking in different sessions about struggles that they've had, whether it was something that came in the way of a religious oppressive behavior or something like that. And it wasn't really under the guise of the faith, but it was more of oppression or control. And then, of course, where I had a different values experience for humans in general, not necessarily about, what people should and shouldn't do that with their life, but more about unconditional positive regard and love for people, no matter their choices. And so I can think of some examples for sure. But do you have any examples that you'd be willing to share that come up for you when you think about someone sharing with you in the counseling experience and something just rubbing you the wrong way because of what it did for them or did not for them, I should say?
Yes, I frequently, most of my clients have some sort of faith, whatever it looks like. And that doesn't have to be Christian, but there's different ideologies that come through my door. And I always get so worked up about pieces where someone is, like you said, kind of that oppressed mentality, that experience they have, especially with women. Obviously, I'm a woman. Mm-hmm. I've gone through my own faith journey myself. I've gone through my own religious trauma as well. And so I have to really check myself to go, hey, this one isn't your experience. This may not actually be traumatic for them. And they share various ideologies and ways of thinking about, either the church or their faith entity that has given them. And anyone that suppresses women or makes them feel like they're less than or little, or they aren't worth sharing anything because they don't have anything worth sharing. That's typically something that gets me a lot. And I have to watch myself from being like, well, we have to work through that and make that better for you. And I have to really put the brakes on to just understand what is that like for them, and is it even important to them? Because that's not always something that we need to tackle in therapy if it's not a problem for them.
Right. But sometimes it is. And that's where, there's an artful balance, I think, that happens. I'll share with you a story. I may not have shared this with you before. It was early on when I was a counselor, and I was seeing a young woman who was recently divorced. She had been married. She was from the LDS faith. And from the time she was a very little girl, she understood herself to be a gay woman. And that was not something that was allowed in her faith. And she really struggled. Her whole life with the shame and the oppression around how she felt she would be perceived by her church. Should that truth ever come out? And she tried so hard to not be, and got married and had a child and so on and so forth, really trying to just not be gay. She did not want that to be who she was because of her importance of her family culture and her faith culture. And I can remember she shares a story where she goes to the bishops, and her account of it was something to the tune of, they told her she was no longer allowed to pray with everybody in the church, that she needed to take a break, and this young woman who's just begging for, what can I do? How can you help me? And because I have these desires, and shaming her and basically making her leave and all of this stuff. And I had so much countertransference in that moment of just wanting to protect her from this terrible experience, because they met her with such, to me, a non-loving stance. And it was just really a hard session. And I got so angry. This was the only time I've ever, boy, did I have to address this in therapy, but I said, can you give me a second? And I actually got up and walked out of the office for a few minutes and tried to collect myself, because I knew I wasn't going to be able to be who she needed me to be for that, to hold her own pain. I was so angry and feeling so protective of her. And I actually used it as a reparative experience. I said, I'm feeling a lot of protection for this young woman that went through this experience. And I'm so sorry you weren't held in a more loving way over that time. And I just felt very angry that you went through that. And so please forgive me. That was not about you. That was about me. And it ended up being, good and reparative. And I think she felt really seen, because she was very shut down. But I just remember thinking, how does this elicit love? And I know they've changed their stance, I think culturally quite a bit. I don't know that today she would be received in the same way. But back then it was really a painful experience. And for her, it pushed her even further away from her faith and her religion, because she was not accepted. And so I think that there can be those faith moments where trauma exists, but of course not for everybody. But this was just one of those moments that really hit me as a therapist, and I had to, I had to really get myself together. But I think faith has so many beautiful attributes and beautiful ways that we can utilize for our clients, if that's one of their tools in their toolbox, one of their sources of resource and resilience. And so what are some effective faith-based coping mechanisms that you think can be used in therapy, and how can they be tailored for individual clients? Like, what do you use? How do you meet people where they are regarding their faith?
Yeah, that's a great question. Any part of therapy, we're resourcing. We're looking at supports. What coping skills do you have? How can we build that up for you? And if somebody's faith and spirituality or religion, however you want to call it, part of it sometimes is very comforting. It's something that they draw strength from and they can go to in times of crisis, and being able to get curious again, going, hey, what are some things that you already have that are already really comforting for you? What's something that you go to when times are hard? And as you build relationship with people, you start understanding more of who they are. And if it's something that's really important to them, it comes out. But also It's our job as therapists to ask questions, to understand all these different pieces of someone's life. And I find a lot of times you can tailor a lot of coping skills and grounding exercises that already exist without a label religion on them. Sure. You can tailor it to anybody's belief system, habits, religious
practices,
affiliation.
Practices.
Yes, absolutely. So I find things like meditation. Meditation can be something where you can make it whatever you need it to be, whatever you want it to be.
Prayer is meditative.
Absolutely.
It's so meditative,
yes.
You know.
Mm-hmm. Scripture, reading scripture, that's something that you can find where you can look up a scripture, meditate on that scripture, even go and journal how it made you feel, what's bringing up for you, meditate on just the different aspects that is hitting you. And that's something that you can make meditation. You could also go, I'm going to meditate on how blue the sky is today and how it makes me feel. It doesn't have to look a certain way.
What do you say? Have you had a client who says, I can't meditate because that's not in line with my spiritual or my faith, And what do you say to that?
That's a good one. I do get that sometimes because there is a lot of fear involved with certain practices that we have now where it may have had an origin and maybe like an Eastern religious origin or just a different culture. And there's not a whole lot of understanding about it. But also, we just don't know exactly where everything actually originates. And sometimes people get well, it's not for my religion, so I need to not be a part of that because it's going to, sometimes I hear, bring an open door for evil to come into my life, or I might be sinning and I don't want to sin because if I sin, then that means I can't go to heaven or I am rejected. And I totally understand those pieces because we don't want to be rejected and we do want to do what's right. And being part of a faith can help a lot with giving us some moral guidance. And in the midst of that, we don't have to be so afraid of everything. There's certain things that have a label, like meditation. It's something that we've called being in a meditative state. And it gets this connotation sometimes of you have to do these chants or the spiritual whatever that comes with it. And it's just not the case. I think there's just a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding about certain practices where you have some superstitious beliefs about things that don't always make logical sense and might not even be in the Bible or in whatever religious text these clients have. So it's just a matter of like education, kind of help showing like, hey, it can look like this and you can call it whatever you want. It doesn't have to be under this certain label.
But let's slow down and get quiet and go inside and just be present with the quiet and be open to and be curious to what comes up for you inside of you. And that surrender and that powerless feeling of not being in control of that can be scary for people. But I think it also gives us a lot of answers as to what the noise in our own bodies and minds are trying to tell us and things that need to be paid attention to so that we can find our way toward healing and towards peeling off the layers of the onions that we develop over time to protect ourselves from, the pain experiences that we've gone through.
Oh, absolutely. And there's times when it comes up where after you've explained and you've given examples and hope, your hope is to help normalize it a little bit so it doesn't feel so scary and unknown. Mm-hmm. And sometimes still they're like, that still doesn't feel good. I don't want to do that. And that's something where you go, cool, let's move on. Let's find something else. And it's never something that we're like pushing an agenda on, but it is our job as therapists to educate people on certain practices they may not know about. That's why they're coming to us, because we know things. We know how to help heal. We know how to help ground and cope. So.
Right. And access pain points in our bodies if we're bottom up trauma trained and trauma is stored in the body. And so I think getting ourselves back in connection with the body does often take things like meditation or yoga or slowing down in some ways so that we can connect with our bodies and whatever that needs to look like so we can get back in connection with our body if we've been pretty disconnected because of our histories or because of trauma. We have to re-enter. I mean, we really can't heal if we're not in our bodies. And so I think sometimes that can be scary in and of itself, quite frankly. So,
facing your trauma, it's not something you typically do willingly.
Someone that says, I need to just pray and I can't, go to therapy because God will help me with it. And that's going to be enough. What do we say to that?
Part of me says it's not my place to tell anybody anything. And another part of me is going, sometimes you do need more help and sometimes it isn't enough. Yeah, I think God or whatever the faith is, I know we're coming from a Christian perspective a lot of the times, but a lot of times God uses various things for our healing. And typically I find if somebody is really wary of something like therapy, it's usually deeper than just, oh, God's going to heal me, or, oh, I can just talk to my friends. They're going to listen to me. And that really helps me a lot. And then nothing gets better. Nothing changes. You might feel a little peaceful in the moment, and that's great. And I definitely do not want to diss prayer because there is so much power in it from just my own personal experience seeing it. And from my own personal experience and my professional experience, sometimes we do need just a little bit more help. And there's this, a lot of people I think have seen it, but there's this animation or this basically story about someone praying and asking God for help. And they're in a flood, they're on top of the house and there's a flood and they're praying that God gives them help. And forgive me because I'm going to mess up on all the details, but basically there's like somebody in a boat that comes by. Hey, do you need help? No, God's coming. And then a helicopter drives by. Hey, do you need help? And they're like, no, God's got it. And then you have this other piece here that's coming by them and they're like, nope. And then eventually the water succumbs and they pass away and they get to heaven and they're like, God, why didn't you save me? And God's like, I sent you 3 different things to come help you. And that always gets me because there is this piece of this give and take where we have prayer and we have our own personal responsibility for our healing.
Sure. And the fact that, if you are a believer in that way, God works in mysterious ways through others to help us find what we're supposed to find in that moment or whatever that time is. So when you think about like where we have limitations, I think something that I found very important in my work as a therapist is if I don't know, I go to get consultation from someone who's kind of high up in whatever that church is. I've been on the phone many a times with bishops from the LDS church. I have a lot of LDS clients or former LDS clients and calling and saying, this person's struggling with shame around sex or around their body or around, some different, newly in a marriage and they don't know anything about their body and they feel a lot of shame and everything's really uncomfortable. And they've never been free to know anything about their bodies and explore and things like that. So I'm like, I'm going to phone a friend and I'll get back to you the next session because I don't want to inadvertently mislead somebody away or toward anything that isn't for them. And so, I will typically err with just leading with love. And if you feel shame, that's probably not for you because your body is beautiful and we were made to feel good and we don't know what we don't know. So it's okay to explore and get curious serious, if that's what's going on in your marriage and you're okay and you're the sanctity of your marriage and you want to figure that out together, I think that's really who you need to ask. I don't know if anyone else needs to be part of that decision, you know, and with the phone call, getting validation that that's a good answer, you know, some of those kinds of things I've relied upon because, you know, I know what I think and I know what I was raised to believe, but that might not line up for certain faiths. And so I've definitely cannot stress enough how important it is. And a good therapist should do consultation with someone in that faith if they are not of that faith so that they can better guide you and also get things out of the way that aren't really about it. You know, This is man, this is culture, this is faith. I cleared this up with your bishop. I feel strongly to be able to say, here's where you're getting a little bit run aground and it's probably not serving you in your healing journey. And to be able to really be able to candidly talk about things in that way, I think is really important as well. And so as not to move anybody further away from their faith, that's never an agenda that any of us should have for sure. So,
yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So when I think about therapy and choosing a therapist, how important do you think it is that when choosing a therapist, that they are the same faith as I am? What do you think about that? People who think that that's necessary.
I thought that way one time. I very much was under the impression that I needed to find a therapist that shared the same faith with me. And I did. I found one and it was great. It was a great therapy experience. I also realized as I became a therapist and continued my own therapy personally, if you find a good therapist that is able to keep their own stuff theirs and not put it on you, you actually probably won't know what religion your therapist ascribes to at all because it's not about them. It's about you. And I've had both and it's been amazing. It's more of what's your own personal journey. But it really does just depend on the person. There's times when maybe someone that shares the same faith is going to help you feel the most comfortable. And that's just where you're at. And that's okay. The research does support that can help with certain outcomes with therapy.
A therapeutic alignment. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
At the same time, you know, we don't want to get too myopically focused on something that is an external variable as far as how we heal when there's neurobiology of trauma that's really at the forefront of things. And we need to look at the biology of us. And that's not really an argument at all. You know, there's biology that suggests cellularly we behave in certain ways based on the things that have happened to us. And so that there's not really a place for faith in that moment because there's already the research around biology. Now, that doesn't mean they can't work together. And I mean, I've had clients where I'm like, we're going to do a gnarly piece of work here. And I know that God and prayer are incredibly critical in your resourced and resilience experience. And so would it be okay if before we do this work that we could pray together so that we can get everything on board here so we can do the best, most meaningful work for you and have whatever resources are beneficial for you. And I don't think there's anything wrong with doing that. How about you?
Oh, no, absolutely not. The
person wants to and
tuning in. Absolutely. Yeah. That's something that they've communicated. That's comforting, helpful, supportive for them. You're doing your job as a therapist to remember that and incorporate that.
So we just have a little bit more we're going to talk about today with this topic. And I know we could probably do an entire actual just full podcast on this topic and break it down into so many different areas. But what do you think is the difference between someone who says, and I'll use Christian as an example, but like I am a Christian and I am a counselor versus I am a Christian counselor? How would you differentiate that for somebody? Because we all know as master's level therapists, we are counselors who might identify in a certain way. And we, unless we have very specific training, probably ought not to be doing anything but what we're trained to do.
Absolutely. Well, that's in our ethics as well. So,
right. But I think that it's an interesting thing. So how would you advise someone who, you know, was looking for that and what that means?
Yes. So someone who is looking for a strictly Christian counselor, somebody that incorporates Christianity and faith into therapy regularly. It's one of like almost hand in hand. That's a Christian counselor. And so it just kind of implies that you're integrating faith into counseling methods. Frequently, you're using biblical teachings and prayer as part of the therapeutic process. You're aiming to kind of address psychological issues while considering spiritual aspects pretty much most of the time. And it's always going from that Christian worldview. It's, what will God say about that and different things like that. And on the flip side, when you're a therapist and then you happen to be a Christian as well, those two things are separate. It's basically, I am a therapist and you specialize in whatever specialty is you. Like for me, example, I'm a trauma therapist. I specialize in EMDR, eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing. And I happen to be a Christian. And I don't bring that up in therapy. Right. I don't bring up my religion unless somebody directly asks me. And even then I use a lot of discretion in that, because sometimes there's a bigger reason why they're asking. It's like, hey, are you feeling uncomfortable? What's going on? It's less about what I believe and more about what you're needing and what you're concerned about. But I'm pretty open about my personal life and how that comes into therapy. But yes, like typically when you're a counselor and a Christian and not just a Christian counselor, it's very different, because practicing will look.
And to claim a Christian counselor, what needs to happen?
You have to have special training, and there's a special governing board for Christian therapists. They have their own entity, and you have to go through these very specific training and licensure processes, just like with being other kinds of therapists and specialists.
I think a lot of people don't know that. And I think and then I think that it also oftentimes gets misused, because if we don't have all of that additional training, we need to be very cautious, because we are not experts in that area. Again, back to interpretation and perspective. Those can vary so wildly and drastically. And it's not in our best interest to misstep with our interpretation of something. It's really out of place and inappropriate for that. So I think that it's a good thing to know that when looking for a therapist, and that it's more important probably that they are qualified, that they are a good fit for you when it comes to personality, that their experience, their education, and their advanced trainings work for what your presenting issues are. Truly, that I think is probably the best way to look for that. But at the same time, sometimes that matters to people for sure.
Absolutely.
So how do you think therapists address the stigma around mental health within faith communities and encourage open, supportive conversations?
That is hit or miss. I find faith communities, even in, if we just stick to Christian, as most of my personal knowledge is with faith, there's so many different ideas and beliefs and kind of temperatures for mental health. You have some that are very kind of cold to it, and they're, you only are allowed to be happy. If you're not happy, then something's going wrong, and we need to take some action, or you're even shunned. And other times it's very warm and welcoming and going, hey, everybody's welcome here, and let's get to the bottom of that. You're still accepted. And so it's all over the place, because there's just it's not standardized. It's not something where, every church is different. So there's a big, wide range there you're working with.
Sure. I can share with you something that I do to address this, is I say, listen, can we agree that God or whatever is out there, depending on their faith, that we are designed to have emotions, and we do have affective circuits, and they are not hit or miss. Like, we all have these affective circuits. And what I will tell a client or a prospective person who's talking to me about this topic is I'll say, we're hardwired to have all the emotional experiences. And when we shut any of them down, we're not living the fullest human experience. And so I kind of think that God thinks we could heal, but we can't skip any steps, and we can't ignore any of the big feelings, and we can't hide and oppress and deny our emotional experience and the things that happen to us. So unless we are willing to wade through that, we're not going to find our way to wholeness and healing. And that said, there's no shortcuts. We don't get to just, do anything that allows us full healing without experiencing the full human condition and the emotional expanse of experiences that we are so uniquely afforded as humans. So yes. I say that and I'm like, we don't get to pick and choose the emotions we were hardwired to have. That's not in my hands,
Right. Well, and so often those responses come from just not understanding and not having the tools we need. And that could be across the board and doesn't always even have to be religious related.
Fair.
But I do find a lot of that in the church. Absolutely. And it's well-meaning. We want people to feel good. We want to be close to God, and it's misinformed. And we do need to help educate people to understand just how the body works at a cellular level. Emotions are held in the body, stress, trauma. And when we close, yes, and they need an outlet and they need to get out. You have to feel it to move through it. And so often anxiety, worry, shame, guilt, depression, anger, it can be frowned upon.
Right.
Yes. It's like, what's going on is sometimes people even believe there's an evil spirit living inside of you because you're experiencing that emotion. And I'm not going to get into that at all, but I do know
it's not a can of worms we need to be opening.
Right. With emotions, we are meant to feel the whole spectrum. I love getting out my emotions wheel to show we have every emotion under the sun, and it's just learning how to feel it in healthy ways, because so often we didn't have good examples and we didn't know how to do it, or we didn't have the capacity to deal with it. And like our caregivers didn't. And then that gets passed down generationally, and it gets woven into religious matters, because at the heart of it, there are humans in church and they have their own limited perspectives. And so it's really about like understanding, getting curious, and having some education.
Right. Well, I thank you so much. Are there any other things you want to leave with our audience before we part ways for today related to this topic?
Yes, I think just as a closing note, wherever anybody is at in their journey, if a therapist is listening in or a client, it really is all about, how comfortable are you feeling with your therapist? Do they align with your values? And it's okay if they don't always have the same religion. I have so many clients that come in with a different faith and different practices, and some are all over the place, and it's okay. It's just where they're at. Yeah. And it's
what's working for you, what's not working for you, and how can I help you find your truest self so that you can feel whole and lovable and worthy. And I think that's the desire for all of us. I mean, wouldn't that be beautiful if we all could feel that way?
Right.
We would be out of jobs for sure.
Yes. I know. And I don't have to feel threatened if you have a different belief than me. We can be secure in what we believe and not worry that something else is going to rub off on us. And I've just found at the end of the day, trauma is trauma. And it needs healing just as anything else. And when I use EMDR, I don't ask what faith you are. I go, what's the trauma?
Right. And where is it?
And we heal the trauma, and typically everything flows out of that. And so often you get so free from healing from the past and not having to run away from it. And
people access surrender, and then they actually do have much more freedom. And when you think about the coexisting, freedom from trauma is truly leaning into the powerless and surrendering to what is and was and what we don't have control over. And faith's a bit like that. Like, it's not in your hands. Surrender is really the answer. And so those pieces really marry well together. It's like, we don't get to decide and try. We just want to lean into whatever's coming up and hopefully allow it to have a safe and supported exit. So Bree, thank you so much for being on this show today with me.
Welcome.
I think we could definitely do another one. I just appreciate your time and candor and warmth, and you're just such a doll to work with. And I know your clients love and appreciate your energy about this, and that, the diversity of faith is also part of what makes the human experience beautiful. And I love to get to work with different faiths and different cultures. I think it's fascinating, and I think it's always so beautiful to get to experience those things. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yes.
That's good.
Thank you so much for tuning in to these shows on the intersection of faith and religion and therapy. We hope that you found it helpful, and please leave your questions in the comments below if you have those or thoughts that we should expand upon. And until we meet again, don't forget to lead with love. It'll never steer you wrong.